One, why a course in human sexuality? Most people ask, why should I take a course in human sexuality? Perhaps your friends or family have asked you as well, or will when they hear you're taking this course. Some of you may think you already know everything about it, and the majority of you are completely certain how you feel about it. But how much do you really know about it? First, I've asked you to quiz yourself on how much you know, using the self-test on pages 3 to 5. Be honest, only you will know how well you did. Most people are surprised at what they got wrong. In truth, there are very few things which so many people do and yet are so unwilling or unable to talk about. Why? Because you're often told not to talk about it by your parents, by society. This lack of talking seems to stem from the logic that if you don't talk about it, you won't do it. As we know, this is flawed logic. There's a couple billion people to prove that. Not to mention the fact that lack of talking only leads to lack of knowing. Where do we turn when we want to know about sex? Well, the people and things who will talk. Friends and television. As we know, TV only tells us about the good side of sex, not the consequences, and our friends have also been misinformed and usually don't know all the correct facts. Where has all this lack of talking led us? With 1 in 10 teenage girls pregnant and 1 in 2 teenagers with an STI. Our logic of don't talk, it won't happen seems increasingly flawed. So perhaps if we do talk, we can learn to protect ourselves. Just look at the word many of us use to refer to sex. No, not those words. We'll get to those later. Intercourse. Look in the dictionary. Intercourse means communication. Sexual intercourse is communicating through our sexuality. And by communicating, we can achieve better, more satisfying relationships, as well as to learn to protect ourselves from disease and unwanted pregnancies. Many begin this course thinking sex is something we innately know how to do. In many ways, this is true. Without education, we can figure out the basics on our own, but it's not instinctual. If it was, we would have only one way to do it, like many animals. Yet look at the variety in the cross-cultural perspective. You can see that all in the book. What people find attractive, enjoy doing, and find acceptable is extremely variable. I don't know about you, but if I came across a man with a large pin through his penis, as you can see in the book, I would suggest he would see a doctor immediately. On the flip side, the Thonga have a pretty good point about eating someone else's spit and dirt. We may not be as sexually repressive as the Innis Big, but we have a long way to go before we get close to the Mangans. No one culture, belief, or practice is wrong. They're just highly variable. So with all this variety in the world, why do we do what we do? Why do we think what we think about sexual behavior? The text emphasizes the European perspective, but through westernization, these views have been pushed on a large proportion of the planet and probably applied to the majority of you. Our history has shaped our attitudes, and although they may be changing in some ways, we carry our history with us. It starts with the biblical Jews and their thought of be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Genesis. We will later talk about the fact that we have filled the earth and how to stop overfilling it. As long as sex occurred within a marriage and it was done for procreation, it was sanctified. The human body was fashioned by God and in his own image, and no part was considered less beautiful. Women were considered the property of men, but they still had conjugal rights in the marriage. In Greek and Roman societies, we see more sexual freedom for men. Sorry, ladies. But the human figure is still revered by both sexes. We also see a movement toward the separation of body and soul, otherwise known as dualism, which led to a belief that true spirituality could only be achieved when one ignored the body's needs and concentrated on the soul. The Christians took this idea even further. Early Christian writers turned the guilt for the sin of sex onto women, claiming Eve's original sin as leading to the downfall of both men and women. They also claimed that within a marriage was the best compromise, and if children could be born without the necessity, the world would be a much happier place. The majority of these men, while claiming sex to be sinful, could not separate themselves so easily from it, and in the words of St. Augustine, give me chastity and continence, but do not give it yet. Somewhat ironic that the man whose beliefs on the evil of sexuality have so pervaded our beliefs also could not deny the pleasure of them. All of these beliefs led to early beliefs that any sex was evil, should not be pleasurable, women should be submissive, and sexual activity should be limited to procreation only. The Victorian era sees a great change for women. We're no longer tempting men as we became asexual beings covered from neck to toe, and men became responsible for all the lust in the world. However, lust and sexuality in all its forms were considered bad. With the rise in science, we turn away from sex being bad simply for religious reasons. We now have science to show us the evils of this act. Everything from masturbation leading to insanity and blindness, to menstrual blood spoiling hams, and completely inaccurate accounts of the best time to conceive. It's interesting to note that during this era of asexuality, most women report actually enjoying sex, and people seem to be engaging in plenty of it. However, these beliefs are still present in much of our society to this day. Then, a little over 100 years ago, things really changed. We had more free time, we had cars to get away from watchful eyes, women's rights and freedom, cures for many of those STIs we were afraid of, and finally, the pill. Time started changing fast, and in the face of this new sexual freedom, people tried to leave their past behind them. However, as mentioned before, our past guides us, and we still feel the guilt our forefathers instilled in us. We also have new fears and new STIs, which tend to side with our confusion about sex. Our current primary sources of information aren't improving either. While we rarely hear that we will die for masturbating, I am not certain TV, films, music, and the internet have the best message either. We hear that everyone is having sex and rarely hear about anyone catching a disease. So while the facts are getting more accurate, we aren't always getting the facts. And for our society obsessed with sex in movies, TV, billboard, internet, everywhere, we are still incredibly uptight. I constantly laugh when people complain that our wonderful family pastime of grown men jumping on one another, beating them to a pulp in an attempt to score a touchdown was interrupted one year by a nipple. Something every single person on the planet has two of, male and female. Odd. So, where do we turn to get the answers? We look to science to answer these questions. Sigmund Freud was one of the first to look at sex and as a subject for scientific study, and while he pioneered many ideas, his ideas were still clouded by incorrect beliefs at the time, like losing semen being as harmful to a man as loss of blood. It's not. Henry Havelock Ellis, traumatized by his own childhood problems, sought to truly understand human sexuality and served to be a big stepping stone for future research. Alfred Kinsey also had concerns over sexuality and put aside his research on insects to tackle a field where little at all was known. His research shocked the scientific community as well as non scientists, and while his books were read by many, he was not originally well respected and often condemned. People had too much difficulty grasping what his surveys found. So, Masters and Johnson come along to find out exactly what's going on physiologically. Thanks to their research and understanding of the sexual response cycle is known. Even to this day, while more research is being conducted, people are still not always comfortable about the result of the scientists' findings. Many still think that sex as science is merely justifying as acceptable, when in truth, many are trying to simply understand it. You should realize that, like all science, the information is collected systematically, and all attempts at accuracy are made. Unfortunately, people sometimes lie, and they're more likely to lie when they feel uncomfortable with the questions. No study is perfect in any science. This is equally true with sexuality as a science, but we don't discount other sciences because the answers scare us. With all that taken into consideration, should we teach sex to our children? There are good arguments on both sides. You will not be surprised to hear I am for teaching sexuality in school. I hope you agree, if not now, by the end of term. So let's get started.